We want to thank AMC and Judith Pinero and Lucy for deciding to do something a little different for her keynote. So the conversation and the language is very intentional around dialogue. So what we thought we'd do is each of us take a couple of minutes to, first of all, talk about what we do. Because you heard a little bit about the bio, but that doesn't always tell people what we do. And then we each wanted to give a little bit of thought in terms of how do we think about, and maybe that's where we include a little bit of Helen's question, how do we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we think this relates to some of the work that you all are doing? And then we're going to ask each other a couple of questions, but we really want to hear your questions. That's the language of dialogue, and there'll be mics around. So what do? I work globally on issues of civil rights, diversity, and equity. I work with corporations, I work with art spaces. Currently, I'm working with the United Nations around some of their gender equity initiatives. So I actually leave for Cairo tonight, and this week I'll be doing work on women in leadership and some work on unconscious bias with some leaders in Cairo. So my work really revolves around a couple of things. I'm also a leadership coach, mostly with women and women of color. So it works at the individual level. How do we help people who possibly may have been blocked by some things in their career, who are looking for different opportunities? And then at the organizational level, or community level, depending upon where I am. A lot of my writing in the US has been about race and racism. I'm a mindfulness practitioner, so for me there's a lot of work around the busyness of our lives, the fast pace of our lives, and how that connects to inclusion, which I will come back to. So a couple of notes. I'm gonna just hold your mic, thanks. A couple of notes I just wanted to do. One is, I interviewed some of you just to get a background sort of what you would want Monica and I to be focusing on and talking about. And a couple of thoughts I have as we begin this is that I think one of the things that comes up, and this isn't just in your space, but is how are we defining diversity, equity, and inclusion? Right? What does that look like? So for some of you that I spoke with, that was around race and culture. That was around sort of increasing the numbers and types of people that are coming into your spaces. There was an interesting article that came across my desk. The title was St. Louis Museum Looking to Attract More Millennials, right? And in this particular article in April of 2017, they talked about wanting to have more families and millennials as that demographic of diversity. But I think we have to be very clear in our language. And in the United States in particular, that doesn't always come easily. And this connects a little bit to some of the broader concepts because we like to think that we're all the same. Actually, for some of us in this room, that's the way we actually grew up thinking about the diversity ideal would be that we're all the same. That I'm not supposed to acknowledge that Monica's skin color is different than mine, that we have different backgrounds. We're supposed to always look for those pieces and similarities. Absolutely the case, we're not saying that, but if I don't see different aspects of who we are, we actually can't name it, and we can't look to see potential biases that are there. The other thing I wanted to say, and I think we heard this a little bit, but the current social political climate also has a lot to do with how we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to be careful not to think that we're only talking about the election. So as someone who works on issues of race and racism in the United States, my life has been quite different in the private sector since July and the shootings of Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, and the 2 Dallas police officers. And respectfully, I got an email from someone who wanted me to come and speak, and the email message spoke volumes because it said, since race, this was actually a month ago, I think I told you this, it said, since race is on the fore of our mind right now. And I was thinking, where have you been? I mean, it's, no, and I get it. For some of us, it's right now, but that sentence alone told me that we were looking at things through different glasses and through different narratives. 2 last pieces, and then I'll turn it to Monica for her sort of overview. Harvard Business Review had a really, really interesting article called We Just Can't Handle Diversity. And the article, the reason I like it and I share it with leaders is because it says there are 2 actual challenges when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion sometimes. One is that we have this over-reliance and belief on meritocracy. So, as one of you said in an interview, there's this assumption that there aren't more women in senior positions in museums because maybe they're not there, or maybe there's a pipeline issue, and maybe we don't have people of color in the places. Both of those things I would challenge, right? Either that we're not prepared or we're not there. The other piece that I just want us to hear and think about that's a bit more challenging for some of us is that we have a lack of awareness of systemic unfairness. So I love the conversation about bringing kids to the museum, the teenager piece, because the language that was used was so important for me. The language used was safety. So some of the young people I work with wouldn't probably think they would be able to walk around this space without being followed. Right? So that language of safety was important and touched me. So meritocracy, belief, absolutely. And then this lack of systemic unfairness that might have kept some people from being here. So I want to just throw those things out in terms of how do we think about engagement. Oh, last thing that came up in my interviews, I was saying this to Judith this morning. There's a really important discussion that Monica and I want to push a little bit around the difference between when we're talking about diversity being staff, or are we talking about it being programming? And I think if we have an over-reliance on one versus the other, we're not looking holistically at the conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll leave it there, and then we'll come back, because we worked on questions, so we have questions if you don't, right? So Monica, what about you in terms of, one, what you do? How do you give people a better idea of what you do? And then just some of your thoughts to begin around this whole space. Yeah.
Thank you. Wow. Well, it's so good to meet you all and be here in community with you. My name is Monica Montgomery. I am a creative disruptor. What does that mean? Chronic rule breaker. If people say don't, I do. And I really like to push boundaries and see how we can come outside of our comfort zone in every walk of life. I'm a museum director. I'm a curator. I'm a graduate professor teaching at Harvard University, NYU, and Pratt Institute. And I generally believe that museums should be in service to society. Let's do a straw poll. Close your eyes. If you believe museums should be in service to society, raise a hand. No judgment. All right, we're in a room full of friends. You can open your eyes now. That's exciting. I knew I liked you all. So, you asked so many things. I feel like I want to talk a little bit more about where I'm coming from. I am an outsider coming to this field. I didn't go to school for museum studies. I didn't go to school for art history. I know that that's kind of taboo, but I'm willing to say it on stage to give space for those of us who are coming from career-changing perspectives. But I am very passionate about art and social justice and the ways that catalyzes creative expression and the ways that that moves us forward as a society and as individuals. And I think it's really exciting to consider who a museum serves, especially in this space where so often we're trying to curate experiences and feelings along with artifacts and art, but thinking about how we can catalyze diversity outside of policy, outside of transaction, outside of the usual, but really making a radical and deep systemic change. I think as representatives of equitable institutions, we have to think about how we can be inclusive, diverse, nimble, as well as rooting out implicit biases and unconscious biases that we have that keep us from doing the work. So I'll stop there, and let's cycle back to some of the questions that you had.
Yeah. So, well, a couple of things you just said, and we talked about this on the phone. Talk a little bit about what you just said about transactional. What do you mean by that? What are you looking to sort of move to, from transactional to what? What do you see?
Sure. So transactional diversity, the way that I conceive it is, doing something when it's politically correct, when the cameras are on, when the grant is being written, but not really having an agenda or a strategy to go beyond that. So during an Ethnic History Month, we do ethnic history programs, we put up an ethnic history exhibit, but what about the rest of the year? How can we make that part of our daily practice, not just for the season, but for the continuum, the lifetime of our institutions? That's one way to conceive of it.
So I have to ask, and some of you might know this, but especially with my comment about us being human here on stage, tell everyone a little bit about the Humans of New York story and the impact that had on you and your work. So you were featured as one of the people that they approached and asked a question. That's correct.
Yes.
And what happened?
Well, I bumped into Brandon, who's the photographer for Humans in New York, late one night at the 59th Street train station, and he said, "What's interesting about you?" So I told him like 10 things. He was like, "Yeah, that's cool, keep going." And so finally I said, I am a social justice preschool teacher that's been fired for being a social justice preschool teacher. And then he's like, "Tell me more." So in essence, before I worked in the museum world, I was an early childhood educator. And this was around the time that the Black Lives Matter movement was just starting up and becoming part of the cultural consciousness. And the tragedy happened where Trayvon Martin was ruthlessly killed by the vigilante George Zimmerman. And that really rocked the bedrock of our school community, of the world around me. I was in DC at the time. Everyone was talking about it. There was a lot of buzz, a lot of discomfort, a lot of anxiety. And the 3- and 4-year-olds that I taught felt that anxiety. They felt turbulent and uneasy, and they would ask me unanswerable questions. Questions like, is eating Skittles make you a bad person? Or if I wear a hoodie, will I get shot? Will I get killed? And I just didn't even know. They don't prepare you for that in education school. I didn't even know how to handle those questions. So I talked to the parents about it, and they consented to let me create a curriculum around Black Lives Matter and community care, and how we can stay safe and how we can look out for each other, and really how to make our anxiety lessen by realizing that we're holding each other as a classroom community. So we did that. We did a lot of service learning, talking, trying to break it down to bite-sized pieces for kids that age. And at the end, we wrote Mother's Day cards for Trayvon Martin's mom, sent it to her foundation. We did a lot of good, kind things in the school community and into the world. And at the end of the year, I was feeling pretty good about what I did. The students were feeling better. And the principal called me into her office and said, Monica, I don't know what you were thinking, but your politics are too radical, and that has no place in a preschool classroom. And the administration's been murmuring about you, and we don't like what you've done, and you're fired. So that really rocked me, because to that point, I identified so much as an educator and really loved working with that age group and really loved the work I was doing. So that's when I had to reconceive, okay, clearly my radical politics aren't welcome in a classroom space. And even though I thought I was helping the students contextualize, the administration had other thoughts. And so I had to think, where in the world could I be with these ideas? How can I go someplace and bring a spirit of healing and discussion, and just where can we dialogue about Black Lives Matter and other social issues? And I believe that place was museums, and that's what led me into museum work and curation.
So, Tanya, you sent me a link recently about some of the work you're doing in Portland. Mm-hmm. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because it just came up for me, that's a strong connection to that experience, but also the work that you're doing now.
Sure. So the Portland Art Museum is one of my clients, and they have a great new exhibit that went up in late January, early February, called Constructing Identity, Curator Beresford Booth. And it's a collection of works of African-American artwork done by African-American artists throughout generations. It's really beautiful, really well stated. And they invited me to create and curate a community art gallery where people can feel at ease discussing what they've seen. People can make their own works and have them exhibited on the wall with the same importance and priority as the artists throughout the other gallery spaces, and really encouraging this community engagement dynamic where different groups, school groups, sports groups, activist groups can come and use it as a community commons to discuss and dialogue and make art. And that's been able to really push forward their projects. And to this end, with this theme of the gallery being the art is ours, how we as community members can have ownership over the art and be curators in our own right, just even if we didn't go to school for it, how everyday people can react to art and have their expressions felt. We're doing a festival on Memorial Day about the art is ours and working with the different community groups that have come through to get everyone thinking about art and activism and the fusion of that.
Helen, this is where I think of your question. One of the things we know in the research often is that women and people of color tend to have these skill sets sometimes, or passions, outside of the workplace that are extremely potentially relevant and value adding to something they're doing inside the workspace. So you have people of color, for example, who may have responsibilities at places of worship or in their community. And we don't always allow people to bring in, one, some of those skills that are relevant, because we actually have in mind what are the skills necessary for particular jobs, for particular experiences. One of the things that they're doing at the UN and many other places is when you look at the fact of why you may not have people applying for certain positions, we actually have to say, if we're acknowledging systemic unfairness, so we're looking for, say, one of the things someone in the interview said was, senior curator at a particular museum, many people think you need this, and this type of experience. If we're consistently, historically going by the same set of experiences that we've always used, we're going to get the same types of people. So how we look at people's gifts, skills, and talents outside of what we may have seen is really important. I think the other thing I think you mentioned that's connected to what Helen said is what I've seen work in terms of my own experience going to museums or being in places. I think we heard some of what the Met's been doing, but one of them is asking the question about why we may not be seeing different types of people here. But I just want to underscore something that I said to some of you on the phone and something Monica said. There's language in my diversity world that a lot of consultants use around diversity being built in, not bolted on. So as a woman of color, I don't necessarily want to feel that there's one day that it's going to be cool to be me at the museum. Right? I want to sort of feel that the space is there and welcoming to me all the time. As someone who has a sister with a disability, I want to be able to think about the space consistently as one where I could bring my sister in a wheelchair here, not just that one day that we're talking about accessibility, but over the course of time. So what's not good, I think, what hasn't always worked is when we really don't think from a systemic level, who's at the table? So I'm working a lot in advertising right now, and I just have to tell you that if I told you some of the stories about accounts lost because there was an all-male team for a product which shall not be named that women wear. There was an all-male pitch team. And we can laugh at that and say, wow, but I wonder in terms of us trying to create exhibits as well, or who we choose to bring in as speakers or the events we do, who's making that decision, I think is important.
Just to echo what you said, Tanya, there's this concept that a colleague and a thought leader in the field, Nina Simon, coined in her latest book, The Art of Relevance, called threshold fear. And it is the premise that there are people that are literally seeing a brick wall in front of our institution, and they don't come in because they don't think that they're welcomed, whether it's that they're not native English speakers, or they don't see other people of color there, or they have different abilities. They feel left out and on the margins perceptually before they even walk in the door. And it's up to us to come outside of our institutions, outside of the ivory towers, and go into communities and be with and embedded in spaces to let folks know, yes, you can come in, and here's what we have for you, and we're willing to co-create with you. I believe in that really strongly.
So if we can talk a little bit, because this came up in the interviews and we heard it a little bit more about this social political climate we're living in and how this is impacting some of the museums you're working in. And I hope we can also think about the not just negative ways, but like what are the opportunities we have now in this current social political climate?
Well, from what I've seen, there's definitely a raised consciousness that is having to come about in reaction to some of the negative governmental policies that have come into play. Some friends of mine recently did a Twitter campaign, and it was like a tweet chat / like viral, just everything around this hashtag called Day of Facts. And the Day of Facts hashtag was really asserting that art, science, history, museums are spaces of culture, but are keepers of facts. And in a world of alternative facts, the real facts lay with us. And so museums have been tweeting out parts of their archives, parts of their collections, but also things that they felt to be true, and also echoing the need to save the arts. And I think that's like a positive movement that's come out of a kind of oppressive circumstance. I've just seen a lot of exhibits that are really echoing a social consciousness, pro-Black Lives Matter, pro-immigration, celebrating, the environment, talking about climate change. I think that's definitely more acceptable now. I'm hoping that's becoming mainstreamed. And I think museums are willing to take risks. Some of us are taking risks, despite the backlash from visitors, despite the backlash from boards. I just see amazing stories in Hyperallergic and other journals that I read about museums that are like, you know what, this is not cool. Like, for example, there was a museum up in New England, and they took all of their work down that was made by immigrants, which was like 90% of their work. And they just put a sign up on the wall when they took it down, like, this work was made by an immigrant. The current policies keep going. This work wouldn't even be happening. It wouldn't be allowed. I thought that was a very bold move, very strategic, but it was pointed and it made the point. And on their Facebook and social media pages, a lot of people were like, how dare you? This is out of character. But I applaud them for that because it sparked a conversation.
So the risk-taking is something that actually came up with a couple of people I spoke with. And one person I spoke with, I've been thinking about this conversation, talked about how the current social political climate has made it more difficult for them. because of perhaps some of their donors, because perhaps of some of the leadership. And some of us are asking questions now, and you and I talked about this on the phone, but in New York City, those of us who are from here, we have this New York City ID. And the goal of the New York City ID was actually to bring more people of different backgrounds, particularly undocumented people, to be able to come into spaces. So you can get this New York ID and you could go in and get a discount. What's tended to happen in the current social political climate is that people are worried about showing that ID because they're worried that for some that equates to being undocumented, and are they in fact putting themselves in harm's way? So we're talking about sort of a climate where the initiative was great and it could have had a great idea, but we have to take a risk and see how it works. So someone I spoke with said they're finding that a lot of the conversation, and I would hope we see more of what you're talking about, but just in terms of some of us in this room thinking about strategies and to-dos, which Monica and I really talked a lot about, are we having these conversations? And one person said, actually, no. It's become harder to talk about diversity of acquisitions, harder to talk about the way we want to hire and what type of outreach we're doing. So some of the things are just the challenging conversations around this as well, I think.
Tanya, I wanted to say that, traditionally, museums decided what was meaningful, what was worthy of collection, what should be displayed. But now in this 21st century, we're seeing so much pushback from audiences, from everyday people. There's this whole culture of keeping brands and institutions accountable. And that's something I think we'll have to get used to as institutional ambassadors, as curators, as directors. I know we talked about having the audience have some chance to kind of dialogue amongst themselves in the midst of this dialogue, so this isn't such a monologue. So I have a question for you all to turn and talk to each other. This is a typical preschool teacher move, so bear with me.
Just go with it.
Turn and talk to your neighbors in your cluster. How can a museum and society reflect the best in each other? And how can a museum and society challenge each other? Go.
Well, even more, because they're much less. And I also want to talk about Museum Q, which is the other organization that works on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So maybe you can bring that in. Those are separate entities.
Yeah.
I would bring it in with another type of question. Let's see, what is some of the questions you have? You had talked about museums support.
Yeah.
I could ask you that, and then if you ask me that, I can talk about Museum Q.
Yeah. Also, if you can ask me, I want to look at more on the unconscious bias piece.
Sure.
I think we talked about that last night too.
Yeah. So, speaking about unconscious bias in your work in corporate consulting, do you want me to say corporate
Or
consulting?
just say, you maybe talk about why it's so popular. Like, why are we hearing it all the time, unconscious bias? Yeah.
Okay. So I have that. I have what are you passionate about and hearing in these days of political turmoil?
Right. And then I like what we were talking about, like what the people in the room do. Right? We want to make sure you have some really good thoughts on that.
I do. I want to, yeah.
That could be at the end, yeah.
So why are we hearing so much?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to get feedback from them on this?
Yeah, we can talk a little more because
Yeah. No, but I mean, and then you want to get some. I just want to learn from like people.
Oh, right.
They're here in the front row. Yeah.
Maybe having 3 or 4 people share up. Okay. I would so much about unconscious bias. Who speaks for whom? I'm going to ask you that.
Okay.
Ask me that. What do you see in other industries? And you feel like you can talk about that.
I think yeah, that's fine.
Okay. And then I had how does the work as a consultant mirror challenges in the art world? Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to have a minute or two.
And I think you might have a better sense of how many questions they'll have. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is
Oh, about TEDx talk how to get up standard. You can ask that question.
me what they can do. That's a great tie-in to what can they do. I can ask you that.
Like 1 more minute. We need to tell the young ladies to go around the back.
We just say we need the mic.
Okay, we'll tell them to go around the back. Yeah, singing and practicing, etc. What is the role of gallery interpreter? Trying to tell us that.
Yeah, I think that's gonna also probably, that would, I think, come up in their question. I think that, I wish they could, maybe they can bring the mics to people then.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
Because,
That'll take time for the work. So let's ask them that. What's the young lady's name? Even remember?
sweetheart,
Quick question. So instead of having them come up, maybe you can take the mic to them? Okay. Thanks, Amanda. Good to see you. All right. This one might be seeing you. Okay, I'm going to tell them 30 more seconds. Okay.
This is getting good. 30 more seconds. I'm going to count down at the 10-second mark.
Dying to talk. That's a great way to get them thinking.
I want to say too, even us having a dialogue and doing this, the change of doing things,
Sure,
right? Which is helpful.
which is necessary.
Right.
Yeah. Good. No folks around. Anything else you want me to ask you or highlight?
No, I think that's good in terms of timing. I think we're good. Yeah.
We're going to still aim to end the 10:45.
Probably like 10:50.
Okay.
We'll see when Judith, but she said they, because after us is a break, which is so good.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So they knew they would need it tonight.
I also had stuff about kind of like diversity. This is more about advantage and privilege, but I'll talk about that with you. Drink some water. Good to meet you.
I know, live, right?
And we are going to wrap our conversations, keeping our salient points in mind. And by the time I count to 1, we're going to focus forward. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yes! Wonderful. I would love to hear from these juicy conversations you're having. If anyone wants to share out, no pressure, we're all friends, no judgment. If you want to have one of our young ladies come to you and you have the mic and you tell us what you've been discussing. And don't make me call on you. Okay.
So we were a group of three different kinds of museums: an encyclopedic museum, a modern and contemporary museum, and a house museum in 3 different parts of the country. And we felt that sort of a key issue is board diversity, that so much flows out of that, either literally, specifically, or board as figurehead, and that makes a huge difference in how museums function.
Yeah, so thank you for that. That was actually one of the taboos that some of you said to me in terms of we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of you said, right, but we don't talk about it at the board level. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and what is our ability to impact that board diversity, I think, is a continual change in conversation. Thanks.
Who's next? Here we go in the middle.
This is on already? Yes. We were talking about, this is my colleague Alicia, I'm Michelle, and we both work in Canada. I work on the West Coast, and Alicia works in central Canada. I won't call it the East. And we are both in small museums where we have responsibility for culturally specific collections. We have a large Asian collection. Alicia has a small collection of traditional African art. And our conversation sort of revolved around how you bring the relevant communities to those collections so that we don't recolonize, by presenting the objects only for white audiences. And we also talked about, in Alicia's case, how you program around that collection when you don't have in-house expertise. There is no African curator there, and in our case, we talked about how the role of curator has changed so that now we're in the process, we will soon be in the process of replacing our curator of Asian art, and we have the challenge of finding somebody who is as engaged with people as they are with objects.
I would definitely recommend, I'm glad, thank you for sharing that. You know, thinking outside of the museum, what are some community groups or civic groups or social groups that you can partner with on programming? A lot of times we don't realize the asset that we have, among others, is space. And there are so many organizations that are looking for places to gather and looking for interesting things to learn. So maybe you can look and do a landscape assessment, who's out there, who might want to do programming in conjunction with us and share that authority and that burden. Thank you for sharing that.
So actually, just one last thought.
Oh, sure.
Our curator of engagement has just started a program called Communities and Collections, and she's done just that. And it's that threshold barrier. People were just waiting for the invitation. It's been amazing.
Great job. There's another thing I wanted to mention. There's a TEDx talk one of my colleagues gave. Her name is Cinnamon Legutko, and it's about decolonizing museums. She's at a space called the Abbey Museum up in Maine, but she's working with a lot of indigenous and American Indian populations and working on repatriation of items. And it just kind of breaks down how she's approached it. So that might be great for everyone to watch in their spare time. Any other share outs? Maybe we'll do one more. Yes, here in the center.
Hi, my name is Talisa Fleming. I'm an American art historian. And this is a question that I think a lot of people have had posed to me, and I don't know the answer. But this idea of the ethnic-specific show, the Black art show, the Latino art show, and then this idea that how are we going to get people in museums unless we name these things, 6 Black women artists. I often have problems with that because you would never have, you know, the white male abstraction show. So, and I think also when you look at this idea, when you do have the quote unquote Black show, right, you have an audience shift. You have more African Americans, but you also have less white Americans going to the show, just like movies. You know, African Americans go to all types of movies, but then you have a movie with an all Black cast, and all of a sudden it's a Black movie, and it doesn't speak to a universal, you know, emotions or issues or anything like that. And how can we sort of break that cycle? Because people are interested in everything, and African Americans don't live in a Black vacuum. So we are interested in other things besides the ethnic-specific show.
I feel like you asked and answered your own question, but I'm going to turn it to Tanya to take us.
I mean, I think a couple of things come to mind. One is, I don't know that we're there yet. Right, no, I hear that. I mean, just when I was listening to you, so when I first started collecting art, I actually, a lot of my education came from going to the Black Fine Arts Show at the Puck Building in New York City, where there were actually galleries that were there that would tell me about the different pieces and the different artists, right? So I remember buying my first Elizabeth Catlett piece and then going to a small gallery reception where I met her and I nearly lost my mind, right? But it was this thing of, it wasn't, and I grew up in sort of a home where art was appreciated, but not in the way of knowing other people. For me, I think there's an important part about putting people within the historical context and narrative that they exist, right? So what do I mean by that? For right now, there are some artists that's how they want to be identified, which I also think is a question, which I really appreciate you saying. For me, it's does that artist, does that painter, does that muralist want to be identified that way? And in fact, there's some interesting generational research that some do. Right? Some want very clearly, from an identity perspective, to be in that. I think we have to be careful. I mean, I was thinking about the show, the Marshall show, that got a lot of press and got a lot of different types of people. I think it's how we, and this is, we were going to ask a question about this. I think a lot of it's unconscious bias. Right? So for me, it's, do I think that that's going to be relevant to my life experience? Do I think I'm going to be able to connect? My suggestion as a consultant would be have other people also writing about what they saw in this exhibit, other than just people of color, other than just, in that case, African Americans. But I do have to say, especially in the times we're living in right now, I think it's gonna take a little while before we sort of get there, but you pushed it. Let's not always say 6 women, black women artists. Let's not always say this is an African American show. I will say, just having lived outside the US in different places, you know, particularly in some Latino communities, I do think that if it was a show with Mexican people, that would be a show that some Mexican people might have more of an interest for, and that's absolutely normal. There's an affinity, right, to what people want. But I hear you. I think we need to do a better balance, but I also think it's where we are, and you know, some of you said this to me in interviews, but I think it's what we've been taught to value and not value. And that to me is a really key part of your question, which we all know in this room, but I just want us to sit with that some of us have been taught to value particular types of art, particular artists, and particular people's contributions. So I think we're learning, but I think it's a great question. Yeah.
Something else I would suggest, I mean, you can play with the marketing and the promotions and the naming of a show. So when I curated my first Black Lives Matter show, I didn't call it the Black Lives Matter show. I created a whole brand around The Movement is Rising, which is the name of the show, because I wanted people to feel a sense of aspiration, a hopefulness, and not feel excluded if they weren't Black or hadn't identified with those issues, but also feel like they could get within, behind, among the movement. So there's always ways that you can work with your marketing, your social media team, or brainstorm on your own on how to position it for a variety of audiences. Thank you for that question. Oh, okay, one more person in the center. Please do.
She's getting a mic.
I just wanted to comment as well on the point that was just made about how we define exhibitions and particularly with regard to artists. I see this as a kind of two-stage process, coming back to the point you were making. That initially, I think a lot of institutions in this country, and I'm saying this as someone who has lived in 2 other continents, that you have to see this as a two-pronged process. In the first stage, institutions, first of all, have to make space in their schedules and departmentally to actually incorporate other cultures on the same with the same frequency as one would automatically do the Western canon. So for example, we're accustomed in our institutions to having many departments that look at Western art. We are accustomed to having many exhibitions in our calendar that look at Western art. So right now, many institutions are at the point where we have a token other, whether that's a department or an exhibition or even a program. Even just getting that program in the other category is like a big deal for some of us. Mm-hmm. So I think that until, first of all, we, of course, with our senior managers, impact those exhibition schedules, the events. I mean, there are so many things to be done that perhaps in that stage 1, you have to think about this as something that, okay, at least you've got that exhibition of the 6 Black artists. But at a point when things do change, at a point that stage 2, when that is reached in those institutions, then yes, absolutely. I have seen this for myself in England, where the Labour government mandated that things had to be multicultural, and they were the ones who were giving most of the funds. At that point, it didn't matter because the public had gotten used to seeing lots of diversity. So at that point, an institution can think about dropping, these things because it becomes part of the practice of the institution. Okay. So don't get disappointed or disillusioned. Keep fighting for that one and then try to kind of nudge it up to the 2 or the 3, and then within that look for diversity so that it's not just about one culture or another, and fight for at least some degree of bridging of the disparity. And then we can think about the boards, because I think that right now, I mean, I fought for the first non-Caucasian trustee in our institution on the board. And that was such a big deal. So now I can think about the second or the third or the fourth, but it's literally one step at a time.
Yeah, so thank you for that, absolutely. I think the one caveat I would make to that, or just comma, my mother always says don't say but, because then you negate everything before, right? So my mother's in my head right now. So the one thing I would say is, and again, as a mindfulness practitioner, I just spent a week at Esalen in December doing a self-compassion retreat, which is not related to this topic, it doesn't seem, but it is. Because I worry about the people who are constantly pushing and fighting. And so my only comment to that would be, comma, yes, and I hope that the pushing and fighting are not just the people who might be considered women, people of color, or other. Do you see what I mean? That it has to be sort of this collective pushing and fighting. Because I do think, in some of the conversations I've had, you said it, that one person, that one department, or that person who has the incredible stress, I thought about this a lot, the incredible stress of putting on that exhibition or pushing for that non-white trustee, that's an incredible stress that we then hold. Right? Whereas that should be a shared accountability on some of this. What we know from the research about diversity and inclusion done well is there has to be shared accountability. There has to be leadership at the top. So I hear you about boards and trustees, but there are those 4 things. When I entered the world of management consulting and we looked at diversity and inclusion and equity, the way it's done well is when it's done as a change process. It's not done as a program, it's not done as one exhibition, it's not done as one community day. And those 4 drivers of change that we talked about were leadership, right? Which would be because they're the ones. The second one was education. How are we educating people onto why this is important? The next one was communication and involvement. How are we communicating and involving people? And the last one is measurement. How are we measuring? So if you think about how you're working on these sort of processes, I would say if you're only doing that education one, not looking at leadership, not looking at measurement, we're missing some pieces. And by the way, it wouldn't only be this field. Most people sort of focus on programming, having a day. Monica talked about this, a day, bringing in people for this time. So absolutely, wonderful points. I would just want to hope we wouldn't have the same people fighting for the fights that you're talking about.
I also, and that ends our Q&A portion. I also wanted to echo a sentiment that, any step that we're taking against monolithic culture, against neutrality, against the status quo is a step in the right direction. And I wanted to read a quote about kind of against neutrality. So most of the decisions that are being made are reflecting some form of advocacy or bias, meaning that the facts and the content found in museums is subjective. Many of the decisions are based on aesthetic taste or capitalistic values or the subjective nature of people running the museums. But David Fleming, who's the director of the National Museums of Liverpool, has spoken out against neutrality, and he says, all museum messages are the creation of the people who work at the museum. And while many of these people genuinely strive to present balanced views about the world, every comment they make is an opinion that could be opposed. Every object they choose to display is loaded with meaning. Every decision to omit something from display could be disputed. So it's to the discredit of museums that many still like to portray themselves as without bias, as apolitical, as neutral, when in truth they are the opposite. All museums are full of bias and all museums are political. So that might give some grounding and context to the fight that we are. It's not necessarily against each other or against naming or against, programs versus curatorial versus this versus that. It's really like just pushing back against that monolithic culture, which I think is the antithesis of real diversity and equity work. Now, I want to ask you some questions because I feel like we haven't done that. So tell me the way that the term unconscious bias, implicit bias is popping up. What do you think is stemming that, and what's the work you're doing in those spaces?
Yeah, so how many of you have read something or heard something about unconscious or implicit bias somewhere? Right. I mean, it's sort of most everyone in the room. If you haven't, it's okay. Just Google it and you will have 14,000 hits. It's there. I have a Google alert for unconscious bias, and there are about 4 to 5 articles from around the world each day. research about the topic. So quickly, really, I thought about doing slides on this, but just a quick sort of high level, there are about 11 million pieces of information coming at us at any one point in time through all of our senses. How many of those pieces of information, and those of you who sat with me, you can't answer, so AAMC board, do not answer. Out of those 11 million pieces of information, how many can our brain actually process? Before coffee, after coffee, I know what some of you are thinking, right? So the answer is 40 to 50, 40 to 50, right? So what happens with all of that other information? We forget it, our brain sets things into categories. Those of you who are neuroscientists in the room, you're probably getting hives because I'm literally taking huge amounts of research and putting it into small packets. But the research is saying to us that when we put those things into categories, our brain is going to default to things that are in fact known to us, comfortable to us based upon our past experiences, and clearly impacted by our culture. So the social implications of that are things which are extremely disturbing to me. Things like young black boys actually look and appear more mature to most people, according to the research. Right? So think about that within the context of what's been happening in our country in the last couple of years. The second piece is one that women, this is an interesting Yale University study, that they took men and women in a graduate class and they asked who spoke more in class, right? So they asked both men and women, who spoke more in class? They kept tallies. Both men and women said that women speak more, which is not true. Right? There's a bias, there are assumptions and implicit associations we make about people. So why do I think it's more, why are we hearing about it more? I think we're learning more about it, and we're learning about how it shows up in organizations. There's something called affinity bias, which I think is one of the most common types of bias that we see. I meet Monica, Monica has on jewelry, I love jewelry, all of a sudden I somehow feel a connection to her. And you may not think that it's that important to say that, but this pops up in interviews if you look at the interview data, right? In fact, in the UK, there's a study that says Black and self-identified LGBT individuals, there's actually a spatial difference sometimes in terms of where the interviewer was sitting with the interviewee. Now, if you ask someone about that bias, people would most likely say, I'm not biased. Right, but actually it's happening to us all the time. I'll quickly share a story with you that I often share. I tell because it's funny, but it shows what happens. So I do this for a living. So I'm sitting on a plane, and I get bumped up, and I'm sitting next to a white woman from Iowa, probably in her early 60s. And so we both have wine, and we're talking, and she tells me after talking about her career that she sometimes goes hiking by herself in Southeast Asia. And I had this moment of looking at her, and I did what we do when you have an unconscious bias. I said, really? And then I was like, oh, Tanya, that was an unconscious bias. So then I started apologizing to her, and then she said, is it the wine? Like, she couldn't figure out what was happening. And what it was is we do it all the time, right? I can think that someone has more information. I can think that someone's smarter. I can think that someone's more talented, simply based on my bias. So I think it's happening more, one, because of the diversity that we're seeing. Right? We are sort of, I don't want us to leave on a negative note, that we are seeing increased in diversity. There was a study that I looked at about the arts, and I just want to name it because I think it's important. I told some of you this, but there was a 2015 study from the Mellon Foundation, AAMD, and AAM that there's some progress in gender equity, but showed a significant gap in the number of individuals from underrepresented groups. But we're seeing like progress. And so I think that more visible diversity actually is part of it. So the triggers for unconscious bias are usually race, gender, age. Those are often visual cues. And then I'll end on this about unconscious bias because this is just as important to me. We're also moving so quickly, and not just because I'm a fast-talking New Yorker, but we're literally moving at such a quick pace. Unconscious biases are actually also magnified during deadlines, time constraints, stress, and need for closure. When is that happening in your lives? Right, so if you accept these research and these connections, then you're seeing that we're moving so quickly. I don't have time to stop sometimes and wonder if my biases are up and running. That's why the mindfulness research on unconscious bias is of interest to me, because it's saying, if I took a pause before interviewing someone, if I took a walk, if I put down the resume before automatically going with my assumptions, we could actually pretty much change things. But so we have a couple more minutes. I want to ask you a couple of things, and we talked about this also, leaving with just some to-dos, right, for people to be thinking about. But can you talk a little bit about the Museum of Impact and how you see that connecting to this conversation?
Happily. So, remember the got fired as a preschool teacher part of the story? So, right. So from there, thinking, how can I explore, contextualize, got into the museum field, decided that I was gonna start a mobile social justice museum that was dedicated to art activism and social movements, and really having a deep dive and having a way to express around these topics. Now, I didn't know anyone that's ever started a museum. I looked up some things online, and I took classes as well, but I really decided that I was gonna learn by doing and starting to work in the museum field. So I came in as an outsider, working my way up from unpaid volunteer, who no one even paid attention to per diem educator, to education director, up and up until I became a historic house director, and learning all along the way. I will say that that process was not pretty, and in the process of that, I co-founded an organization called Museum Hue to advocate for people of color in arts, culture, and museums, because so often we are just getting the short end of the stick as professionals. We're not getting the promotions we deserve. We're not getting the consideration. As audiences, we're feeling that threshold fear. And I wanted to attack it from every level. I felt like there were a lot of great movements in the world, but there was space for us to gather and for us to intentionally, unapologetically be in spaces. And so Museum Hue has grown from a seed of an idea to a group that now is 15,000 strong. We do professional development events, mixers, online tweet chats, and all sorts of things to advocate for folks in the field. And we've also been helping place people in careers. We have a private Facebook jobs group that's about 2,000 people, and to date we've put 25 people in museum work of color, and I'm really proud of that. So, right, just starting stuff right and left. So in total, towards the end of my journey as a historic house director, I decided I really needed to stop sitting on the idea of creating a Black Lives Matter exhibit and starting a social justice museum and take action. And so I gathered a group of dedicated volunteers and worked very closely with activists on the front line to start the Museum of Impact. And to date, we've done 25 pop-ups all around the country. We do exhibits anywhere from a day to several months, and museums, universities, youth groups, churches book us to come to their space to really interpret social justice. A lot of institutions are scared to touch these issues. They're not sure how to approach it. They don't know what to do. But we specialize in that, and we have a lot of creative, innovative ways to get dialogue going and to present artists that are often independent, that aren't even considered in the art world. We specialize in bringing those people and amplifying their platform, as well as activating spaces around these issues. It's been really exciting, joyful work. We did a pop-up at the Brooklyn Museum last February about the Black radical tradition. That had 4,000 people come through the space in 3 hours, and that was one of our other shining moments. And now people are booking us writing left to come. With everything happening in the news, more than ever, people are giving us a call and saying, how can we bring this to our community? So that's been really, really exciting work, and I feel like it's really meaningful with the path I've taken. It's very been winding and circuitous, but this is the moment that I came to do this work.
So as we think about closing out this piece, we both said that people leave this diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation sometimes with their head swirling, right? And wanting to know, well, give me the 3 steps of what I should do to make it better, right? And for those of us in the U.S., we have a couple of 100 years to make up for. I'm not sure we're going to get there with 3 bullet-pointed steps. But I think Monica and I did talk about sharing some things that we're seeing that can work, or things that you may want to think about more. And I love if it would be possible for you to talk about this upstander concept, and you talked about this in your TEDx talk. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I did a TEDx talk, How to Be an Upstander, last year, and it was often, this was the day after the election. So there was a heavy-heartedness in the air, and I definitely had to uplift myself so I can uplift others. But it was about how can we stand up and speak up and act up on our values, on what we believe is right, no matter our profession, no matter our background, and really be change makers in an active sense. So with that, I've been really thinking about how to extend the upstander concept and the tenets into the museum work that I do and other fields that I consult in. I want to kind of speak a little bit about solutions, because the TEDx talk is there and you can feel free to watch it. But thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion. First off, it's not a destination, it's a journey. So it's not this binary like, oh, now we've done it. We hired 3 people, we have our board diverse, we put up 2 shows, we're done. You're never done. You're never done. It is always ongoing. There's always room for improvement, and that's something that I want to drive home, in that whatever actions you're taking, feel encouraged in that and find people that can support you in that work, because it's important and it's never over, but also there are a lot of other like-minded people looking for sparks of inspiration. I think that rooting out the unconscious bias through trainings, through tests, something that you spoke about, that's very important. Thinking about staffing equity, how to promote from within. Not necessarily just hiring people from outside of the world, but there might be someone in your institution looking for increased responsibility, and how can you mentor and have that person apprentice to pipeline them to leadership positions? Because one of the things I'm passionate about, seeing more people of color in leadership in museum work. There's not enough of us, and I think that there's room for growth there. Additionally, thinking about your culture as a museum, so beyond staffing, beyond audiences, let's say something happens in the world that is a tragedy. So often we have to just tune out and we have to numb ourselves and be apathetic just to get through the day. But I am of the belief that our organizations should be caring and empathetic, and how can we take time to hold space for each other to process through things that happen. When a Black Lives Matter incident happens and another person of color is killed through state-sanctioned violence, there is room for a discussion, there is room for grieving, and we have to make sure our institutions are holding space for each other and our workers and our coworkers and our peers in that way. I have some more solutions, but I didn't want to dominate. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I really like what you were just saying. So a couple of things I think that I'm seeing is, I just want to pick up on this piece, which is have the dialogue, right? Create the space, create the time for people internally to have the dialogue. There's some really interesting work that On Being's done. If you go, it's called the Civic Conversations Project. And they just have all these different people doing these stories and sharing their stories. And BBC did some really interesting research on bias, and they talked about how if you approach bias from this sense of curiosity, right? So actually looking to say, what could we do better? How can I include more people? That's an element of curiosity versus, my way is better than your way. The one thing I want to make sure we don't leave here without saying is diversity and equity and inclusion are separate. We use them sort of interchangeably, but actually you can have a group of diverse people in a room and not have everyone feel included. We've only talked about a couple of different types of diversity. We haven't talked, for example, about LGBT people, perhaps inside of organizations or museums or in spaces, and how they might feel in terms of being welcomed, maybe some jokes that are told. It's really, for me, after 24 years of doing this work, we really have missed the boat in some ways around not addressing aspects of culture. So, for example, the research on micro inequities, that we have 40 years of research that show when Chester Pierce in the 1970s talked about racial microaggressions, Mary Rowe at MIT continued the research looking at why women and people of color were leaving organizations. It wasn't big, blatant things. They were actually little things with cumulative impact over the course of time. The analogy that's sometimes used as water on a brick. So the moment I say to you, well, where did you go to school? Oh. Didn't you know that piece of art? Oh. I went to Vassar. So those of you who know Vassar, the art history department is incredibly strong, has always been strong. And the fact that I didn't take art history is like a sin. And I'm going to my reunion, and I hear about it. I sat in on some of the classes. I tested some of my friends with their big art history book. But we joke about it being this sort of Vassar piece, but what about people, I didn't do it because I didn't do it, but what about people who were scared about doing that? We haven't talked about first generation students or first generation people, meaning either first generation in the country or first generation college. And what that means, that's an aspect, I think, of diversity. So I want to just make sure this culture piece is discussed, really doing an assessment of what does our culture look like? What are the ways of being, what's accepted and not accepted? I will tell you from a cultural landscape perspective, meaning outside cultures, different cultures, if you have a culture where I have to constantly speak up and push my ideas and celebrate myself and use the word I in every sentence, you're not going to perhaps have the benefit and gifts and blessings of some of the people who didn't grow up in that way. So that's a really courageous conversation to do an assessment of culture. What does success look like here? Is it all introverts at the top? Is it all extroverts at the top? Did they all come from New England? Are they all from a certain part of the UK? You know, I mean, really asking questions about what are the systems we've created that have created people just like us. There was a wonderful piece of research that said, from the UK, that said hiring managers, even though they know the research, continue to hire mini-me's, right? And the last piece of research I'll share, and then Monica, I'd love just to hear a couple of other things about to-dos. There's a tremendous amount of gender research coming out now. Some of it's helpful, some of it's not so helpful. We have to look at also intersectionality. My sort of opinion and my identity is not just as a woman, but it's as a woman from a particular background, et cetera. But there's a piece of research recently by McKinsey, and it says why we need a new gender playbook. And I just want you to hear this. And it said that while many CEOs, private sector research, while many CEOs understand that gender is important and are focusing on gender, the language in this was so helpful to me. It said, but women aren't feeling it on a day-to-day basis. That's the key to this. How do we have a good diversity, equity, and potential inclusion initiative? But people have to feel it on a day-to-day basis, which is those aspects of culture, those micro behaviors that I think are important. So Monica, one or two more before we end and send people to break that you think people could do?
Sure. I think also reframing the practice of recruiting for diverse persons. I'm speaking specifically about multicultural diversity, thinking where else aside from our websites can we post jobs? Where else aside from the usual vehicles? And how can we go beyond who we would think would work in museums and think of other types of persons? So thinking of formerly incarcerated persons, senior citizens, talking to high schoolers about the art world and the cultural world so that they can be encouraged to get in the work, recruiting from Job Corps, Peace Corps, partnering with HBCUs, that's historically Black colleges and universities, and just being aware that there's still a digital divide and not everyone is always online, and we could always print things on paper. And that's something that seems kind of like too simple to even work, but one never knows. And so I think that's something else to consider. And just in general, to keep yourself encouraged, build this generosity network. There are people in your region, in your city, maybe next door to your institutions that you can exchange with. Maybe you can even start some sort of brown bag lunch to talk about what you're trying, what you're championing in your spaces, and being allies and agents for change together. And I'll stop there.
So to end, Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese monk who was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize by Dr. King. And he practices mindfulness. He's a Buddhist teacher. And he has this phrase, which I always think about around this topic. And his mantra that he sometimes uses, one of the many, is no mud, no lotus. Basically, you can't have this beautiful lotus flower if you don't go through some mud. And what I do know from teaching innovation and creativity, which is the last courses I taught at university at Georgetown, is that you have to be willing to make mistakes. There's going to be some mud to get to that lotus, and I think the language of the prong approach or phases, and I appreciate you saying we have to sort of keep up ourselves being motivated, because some days it feels like we're not gonna sort of get through it, but you should see me in the mirror sometimes in the morning before a client meeting, no mud, no lotus, no mud, no lotus, right? I'm sure that's not what Thich Nhat Hanh wants, but the spirit's still there. So I would just say there'll be some mud, right? But no mud, no lotus. So thank you for being with us. We're heading to a break. Judith, thank you very much. Monica, thank you really for being here and having this conversation. Thank you.